What does it actually cost to grow up in front of 100 million people? Not metaphorically, literally. What happens to a childhood when it's compressed into rehearsal rooms and press lines before it's even finished? Jungkook was 15 years old when Bangtan Sonyeondan debuted. 15, an age when most people are worrying about exams and curfews. He was worrying about choreography, vocal takes, and a company that wasn't even sure it would survive the year. So here's the real question. Not, was it hard? Of course it was hard. Every idol says that, and it means almost nothing anymore. The real question is this. What specifically did Jungkook say was the hardest part? Not the schedule, not the fatigue. What was the one thing that even years later, as a grown man with Grammy nominations and sold-out stadiums behind him, he still brings up when someone finally asks him the right question? Stay with this one, because by the end, you'll understand something about the golden Maknae that most highlight reels never show you. Let's start at the beginning, because you can't understand what Jungkook gave up without understanding what he was before any of this happened. He was a kid from Busan, a kid who wanted to play badminton, a kid who liked watching performances, who got pulled toward music almost by accident, the way most passions actually start, not with destiny, but with curiosity. In 2011, at around 13 years old, he auditioned for Superstar K3, a reality competition that many young hopefuls tried their luck on. He didn't make it past the preliminary rounds. And here's the part that gets glossed over in most retellings. That failure became the pivot point of his entire life. 7 different entertainment companies noticed him in that room. 7. He had his pick. And out of all of them, he chose the smallest, the least certain, Big Hit Entertainment, partly because of one particular trainee already there, a rapper going by the name Rap Monster. That's the person we now know as RM. Think about that decision for a second. A 13-year-old choosing his entire future, not based on money or prestige, but based on wanting to be near someone he admired. That instinct, chasing connection over convenience, would define almost everything that came after. But choosing Big Hit meant choosing uncertainty. This wasn't a company with a guaranteed hit machine. This was a company on the edge of financial collapse, betting everything on a group of kids nobody outside their own walls believed in yet. In 2012, Big Hit sent him to Los Angeles to train and dance under Movement Lifestyle. He was still just a young teenager, but already living out of a routine that most adults would find exhausting. Training for hours, absorbing choreography, trying to close the gap between talented kid and idol who can carry a stage. By his own account and by accounts from those training alongside him, the days ran long, reportedly well past 12 hours some days. Dance, vocal work, evaluations, repeat. This is the part where most videos would show you footage. We're not doing that here, so picture it instead. A young teenager, thousands of miles from Busan, learning to move his body on command, learning to perform joy and confidence on cue, while somewhere underneath all of that, he was still just a kid figuring out who he was. And this is where the first real tension starts to surface. Because growing up as a trainee doesn't just cost you free time, it costs you something much harder to name. The ordinary, boring, forgettable moments that most people don't even realize shape them until they're gone. We'll come back to that because Jungkook himself, years later, was asked directly what he missed, and his answer wasn't about fame or money or exhaustion. It was about school. Hold on to that, because that single word, school, carries more weight in this story than it seems at first. Jungkook debuted with BTS on June 12, 2013, 15 years old, officially the Maknae, the youngest member of a 7-member group that at the time almost nobody outside a small devoted fan base had heard of. Big Hit wasn't YG, it wasn't SM, it wasn't JYP. It was small, underfunded, and by several accounts teetering financially in those early years, which meant the 7 of them didn't just have to be good, they had to be relentless, because there wasn't a safety net underneath them. For most of the members, that meant grinding through an industry that already runs on exhaustion. But for Jungkook, it meant something else layered on top, being the youngest in every room, on every stage, in every negotiation about who he was allowed to be. This is where the story starts pulling in two directions at once. On one hand, an extraordinary opportunity, chosen by 7 companies, mentored by 6 older members who, by numerous accounts over the years, treated him less like a co-worker and more like a little brother they were determined to protect. On the other hand, a childhood being spent almost entirely inside dance studios, tour buses, and dormitories, with ordinary life becoming something he'd have to consciously go looking for later, if he ever found it at all. Both of these things are true at the same time. That's not a contradiction. That's the actual shape of what happened to him. And it's why the easy, simplified version of this story, hard childhood, happy ending, doesn't hold up under real scrutiny. Because here's the open question we're going to carry through this entire video. If you ask Jungkook right now what he actually lost during those years, not what fans assume he lost, but what he has said in his own words when directly asked, would his answer match what you'd expect? We already gave you a hint: school. But there's more underneath that single word than a missed classroom. There's an entire structure of what growing up is supposed to look like. Friendships that form in hallways, boredom that becomes memory, small failures that don't end up on camera. Jungkook didn't get most of that, and the way he's talked about it across different interviews, years apart, tells a much more layered story than "idle life is hard." That's where we're headed next, into exactly what he said, when, and to whom, because this is the part most casual coverage skips entirely. Let's get specific, because vague sadness makes for weak storytelling, and this story deserves better than that. In a solo interview with Rolling Stone, conducted while BTS's promotional schedule was disrupted by the pandemic, Jungkook was asked a direct question. What had he missed out on from an ordinary life because of the path he chose so young? His answer wasn't about the schedule. It wasn't about scrutiny or pressure or fame. He pointed to something almost mundane: his school days. Sit with how strange that is for a second. Here is someone who, by that point, had already performed for arenas of screaming fans across multiple continents. Someone whose face was recognized on nearly every continent on Earth. And when asked what he lost, he didn't reach for anything grand. He reached for something small: classrooms. Ordinary days. The kind of thing most people don't even remember as precious until it's gone. That's the first open loop starting to close, but only partially, because there's more to it than a single interview answer. Because Jungkook's relationship to school wasn't simple abandonment. He didn't just walk away from education. Records show he moved from schools in Busan to Seoul's School of Performing Arts, known as SOPA, an institution built specifically for young performers trying to balance training with formal education. He graduated from SOPA in 2017, 4 years after debut, meaning he was still finishing coursework while BTS was already climbing toward global recognition. And it didn't stop there. In 2022, nearly a decade after debuting, Jungkook completed a bachelor's degree in broadcasting and entertainment from Global Cyber University. Think about the timeline here. This wasn't a teenager casually finishing high school requirements. This was a man in his mid-20s, already one of the most photographed people on the planet, still going back to close a door he never got to fully shut the first time. Why does that matter? Because it reframes the missed school comment from something passive into something he actively tried to recover years later on his own terms. But this is only part of the picture. What happened next is the part most casual retellings skip entirely: the specific weight of being the youngest. Jungkook wasn't just young when he debuted. He was structurally the baby of an entire operation. 6 older members, an entire company, an entire fan base, all of them, in different ways, watching a young teenager mature in real time, on camera, under a level of observation most adults never experience even once. That's the important distinction, and it's one that separates this story from a simple tragedy narrative. Jungkook wasn't crushed by being young in an adult industry, he adapted to it. But adaptation isn't the same as it being easy, and the same interview reveals just how much of his identity is still, even now, tied up in a process he began as a young teenager and never really finished. In that same 2026 conversation, at 28 years old, with nearly half his life spent inside BTS, Jungkook admitted something remarkably candid, that he still feels like he's forming his sense of self. Not finished, not settled, still forming. That's not a small thing to say publicly. Most people his age who didn't grow up under a global spotlight still wrestle with identity, but they get to do it privately in the ordinary friction of school, first jobs, failed relationships, boring Tuesdays. Jungkook has had to do that same internal work while also being one of the most recognized performers alive. He even pointed to one specific window in his adult life where he got close to something like real separation from the machine, his mandatory military service. Not the pandemic, which he described as still being pretty damn busy behind the scenes, the military. That was the only stretch of time, in his own words, where he was fully away from music. And what did he say he felt during that rare pause? Not peace, not relief. He said all he could think about was wanting to get back, to perform, to sing, to dance. Even his one real break from being an idol became defined by missing being an idol. Let that sit for a second, because it tells you something almost paradoxical about what hardest part even means for someone like Jungkook. It's not just what idol life took from him, it's that idol life became so deeply woven into who he is that even when the machine stopped, part of him didn't know how to stop with it. This is the tension the rest of this video is going to sit inside. Not a simple story of a boy who suffered and triumphed, a more complicated one of someone who lost pieces of an ordinary childhood, adapted so completely to the role built around him that he came to feel at home inside it, and is still, even now, working out where the performer ends and the person begins. But this is only the beginning of understanding what that cost actually looked like day to day, because there's another layer to this, one that isn't about school or identity, but about the people who were there for it, the 6 members who became something like a substitute for everything else he gave up. If school was the ordinary life Jungkook lost, the members were what filled that space instead. Not a replacement, nothing really replaces a childhood, but the closest thing to family structure he had access to, day after day, for years. Multiple accounts describe grueling training days, sometimes stretching well past 12 hours, shared dormitory life, and a company still finding its financial footing. In an environment like that, isolation would have been easy. Instead, what emerged, by Jungkook's own repeated description across interviews, was something closer to brotherhood. Speaking about it years later, he credited the older members directly, RM, Jin, Suga, J-Hope, Jimin, and V, for shaping who he became, not just as a performer, but as a person. He said he was grateful for the feedback they gave him, positive and negative, and that meeting them was something he considered a genuine blessing in a career path that otherwise pulled him away from almost everything familiar. That's worth pausing on, because it reframes the entire lost childhood narrative one more time. Jungkook didn't just lose ordinary milestones, he gained an unusual one instead. 6 people who, in a very real sense, helped raise him inside an industry that doesn't typically make room for that kind of care. But here's where the story adds another layer of tension, because brotherhood doesn't erase loneliness, it just changes its shape. Fast forward to 2023, Jungkook released his solo debut single, 7, that July, followed shortly after that by 3D in September. For the first time in a decade, he was stepping onto stages without 6 other people beside him, and in interviews around that period, a different kind of longing started to surface, not for school, not for ordinary teenage milestones, but for the specific, unglamorous texture of being in a group. In an interview with SiriusXM's One Morning Mashup, he was asked what he missed most from his time performing with BTS now that he was navigating a solo career. His answer wasn't about the spotlight or the choreography or even the music itself. He said he missed the noise. The sound of his bandmates hanging out nearby in the green room, the atmosphere that used to fill a space before a show, voices, movement, small chaos, and how quiet that same space had become without them. There's something almost devastating in how small that detail is. Not "I miss performing," not "I miss the fans." He missed background noise, the kind of thing you only notice once it's gone. Around the same period, in a separate conversation with Chicago's Kiss FM, Jungkook opened up about something even more personal, a moment where he said he was going through a genuinely difficult stretch, and it was ARMY, BTS's fan base, who helped him find his footing again. He described fans not as an abstract audience, but something closer to family, though he was careful to note it as something even bigger than that label usually implies. He called them, in his words, a ray of light. Here's why that phrase matters for this story specifically, because it reveals where Jungkook's support system actually lived across the years, not in the ordinary structures most people rely on, classmates, casual friendships, the slow, boring accumulation of unremarkable days. His support system was built almost entirely out of the unusual, bandmates who became brothers, and a global fan base who became, in his description, something like an emotional anchor. That's not a conventional childhood. It's not even a conventional young adulthood. It's something that had to be built from different materials because the standard ones weren't available to him. And here's where we have to be honest about something, rather than just building toward a tidy emotional payoff. Jungkook has never framed his path as a tragedy. He's never publicly said he regrets it or that he traded for something else. What he has said, consistently across years of interviews, is something more nuanced, that there were real things he gave up, real gaps in his sense of self that persist even now, and real gratitude sitting right alongside that loss for the specific people who helped him survive it. Both of those things are true. Holding them together without flattening one to make the other feel bigger is the only honest way to tell this story. So where does that leave the original question this video opened with? What specifically did Jungkook name as the hardest part of growing up as an idol? Based on what he has actually said across multiple interviews spanning years, it wasn't the physical exhaustion of training, though that was real. It wasn't the scrutiny, though that was constant. It was something quieter than either of those. It was the absence of ordinary time, school days, background noise, the slow, boring texture of a childhood most people take for granted until someone asks them to describe what they'd miss if it disappeared. And underneath that, something even more difficult to sit with. At 28 years old, with an entire body of work most artists would consider a career's worth of achievement, Jungkook has said plainly that he's still figuring out who he is outside of the role he stepped into as a teenager. That's the emotional core of this entire story, not a wound that's been neatly healed, not a triumphant "it was all worth it" ending, something more honest than that, an ongoing process, still unfinished, carried by someone who has spent nearly half his life growing up in front of the entire world. Here's the moment this entire video has been building toward. Not a scandal, not a dramatic reveal, but something quieter and, in its own way, harder to sit with. Picture the timeline laid end to end, a 13-year-old choosing a company based on wanting to be near someone he admired, a 15-year-old debuting into a group nobody outside a small fan base had heard of yet, a teenager finishing school not in a normal classroom but at a performing arts institution built around people just like him, graduating in 2017 while his group was already becoming a global phenomenon. A young man, nearly a decade later, still going back to finish a degree he never fully got to complete the first time around. And then, at 28, after Grammy nominations, after sold-out stadiums, after becoming one of the most recognized faces on the planet, sitting across from a journalist and admitting plainly that he's still forming his sense of self. That admission is the emotional peak of this story because it strips away the easy narrative. It would be simple to tell this as a rags to riches arc, hard beginnings, glittering payoff, roll credits. But that's not what Jungkook himself has described. What he's described is something closer to an unfinished process. Gratitude for the people who raised him inside an unusual structure, real grief for the ordinary moments he didn't get to have, and an identity that even now is still being built rather than simply arrived at. Remember the military service detail from earlier, the one stretch of true separation from the machine he'd been part of since childhood. And what filled that space wasn't relief or the discovery of some hidden self waiting underneath the idol persona. It was longing to get back on stage. That's not a flaw in his story. It's the clearest evidence of just how completely those two identities, the person and the performer, have grown into each other since he was 15 years old. So when this video's title asks what Jungkook once admitted was the hardest part of being an idol at a young age, the honest answer isn't a single dramatic sentence. It's a pattern repeated across years of separate interviews, in separate contexts, to separate journalists, always circling back to the same quiet loss. Ordinary time, school days, background noise in a green room, the slow, boring, forgettable texture of a childhood most people don't value until someone asks them to describe what they'd miss. That's what he's named consistently as the cost, not the training, not the fame, the ordinariness he never got to keep. Now, the closing. It would be easy to end this story with a simple message that Jungkook suffered and Jungkook triumphed and everything worked out, but that framing does a disservice to what he's actually said about himself, in his own words, as recently as this year. He hasn't described a closed chapter, he's described an ongoing one. What's true and what deserves to be said clearly is this. The body of work Jungkook has built since that 15-year-old stepped on stage in 2013 is extraordinary by any measure. Chart records, sold-out arenas, a solo career built on genuine songwriting growth, and a bond with 6 other men that has outlasted years of exhausting schedules and global scrutiny. None of that erases what he lost, and what he lost doesn't erase any of that either. Both can be true. A person can build something remarkable and still be honest about what it cost them. That honesty, not the polished highlight reel, but the quieter, more complicated version of his own story, is what Jungkook has offered, piece by piece, across years of interviews to anyone willing to actually listen. So maybe the right way to close isn't with a neat bow. Maybe it's with a question back to you. If you had to name the one ordinary thing you'd miss most if your life had been rearranged at 15 the way his was, what would it be? If this video helped you see Jungkook's story a little differently, sit with that question for a moment before you scroll to the next one. And if there's another chapter of this journey you want told with the same care, the same commitment to what was actually said, not just what sounds dramatic, let us know. That's the only kind of story worth telling about someone who's given this much of himself already.